economy in fighting. First is the use of deception, which costs relatively little but can yield powerful results. During World War II, the Allies used a complicated series of deceptions to make the Germans expect an attack from many different directions, forcing them to spread themselves thin. Hitler's Russian campaign was much weakened by the need to keep troops in France and the Balkans to defend from attacks there, attacks that never came. Deception can be a great equalizer for the weaker side. Its arts include the gathering of intelligence, the spreading of misinformation, and the use of propaganda to make the war more unpopular within the enemy camp. Second, look for opponents you can beat. Avoid enemies who have nothing to lose. They will work to bring you down whatever it costs. In the 19th century, Otto von Bismarck built up Prussia's military power on the backs of weaker opponents such as the Danes. Easy victories enhance morale, develop your reputation, give you momentum, and most important, do not cost you much. There will be times when your calculations misfire. What had seemed to be an easy campaign turns out hard. Not everything can be foreseen. Not only is it important to pick your battles carefully then, but you must also know when to accept your losses and quit. In 1971, the boxers Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, both at the heights of their careers, met for the World Heavyweight Championship. It was a grueling match, one of the most exciting in history. Frazier won by a decision after nearly knocking out Ali in the 15th round. Both men suffered horribly in the fight. Both threw a lot of good punches. Wanting revenge, Ali gained a rematch in 1974, another grueling 15-round affair, and won by a decision. Neither boxer was happy. Both wanted a more conclusive result, so they met again in 1975, in the famous Thrilla in Manila. This time, Ali won in the 14th round, but neither man was ever the same again. These 3 fights had taken too much out of them, shortening their careers. Pride and anger had overtaken their powers of reason. Do not fall into such a trap. Know when to stop. Do not soldier on out of frustration or pride. Too much is at stake. Finally, nothing in human affairs stays the same. Over time, either your efforts will tend to slow down, a kind of friction will build up, whether from unexpected exterior events or from your own actions, or momentum will help to move you forward. Wasting what you have will create friction, lowering your energy and morale. You are essentially slowing yourself down. Fighting economically, on the other hand, will build momentum. Think of it as finding your level, a perfect balance between what you are capable of and the task at hand. When the job you are doing is neither above nor below your talents, but at your level, you are neither exhausted nor bored and depressed. You suddenly have new energy and creativity. Fighting with perfect economy is like hitting that level. Less resistance in your path, greater energy unleashed. Oddly enough, knowing your limits will expand your limits. Getting the most out of what you have will let you have more. Reversal. There can never be any value in fighting uneconomically, but it is always a wise course to make your opponent waste as much of his resources as possible. This can be done through hit-and-run tactics, forcing him to expend energy chasing after you. Lure him into thinking that one big offensive will ruin you, then bog that offensive down in a protracted war in which he loses valuable time and resources. A frustrated opponent exhausting energy on punches he cannot land will soon make mistakes and open himself up to a vicious counterattack. Here are further reflections on the strategy of perfect economy. By Karl von Clausewitz. In the utilization of a theater of war, as in everything else, strategy calls for economy of strength. The less one can manage with, the better. But manage one must, and here, as in commerce, there is more to it than mere stinginess. From The Art of War, by Sun Tzu. He whom the ancients called an expert in battle gained victory where victory was easily gained. Thus, the battle of the expert is never an exceptional victory, nor does it win him reputation for wisdom or credit for courage. His victories in battle are unerring. Unerring means that he acts where victory is certain and conquers an enemy that has already lost. From The Greek Myths by Robert Greene. Achilles now routed the Trojans and pursued them toward the city, but his course too was run. Poseidon and Apollo, pledged to avenge the deaths of Cygnus and Troilus, and to punish certain insolent boasts that Achilles had uttered over Hector's corpse, took counsel together. Veiled with cloud and standing by the Scian gate, Apollo sought out Paris in the thick of battle, turned his bow, and guided the fatal shaft. It struck the one vulnerable part of Achilles' body, the right heel, and he died in agony. From the I Ching. Limitations are troublesome, but they are effective. If we live economically in normal times, we are prepared for times of want. To be sparing saves us from humiliation. Limitations are also indispensable in the regulation of world conditions. In nature, there are fixed limits for summer and winter, day and night, and these limits give the year its meaning. In the same way, economy, by setting fixed limits upon expenditures, acts to preserve property and prevent injury to the people. From Ecce Homo by Friedrich Nietzsche. In all this, in selection of nutriment, of place and climate, of recreation, there commands an instinct of self-preservation which manifests itself most unambiguously as an instinct for self-defense. Not to see many things, not to hear them, not to let them approach one, first piece of ingenuity, first proof that one is no accident but a necessity. The customary word for this self-defensive instinct is taste. Its imperative commands not only to say no when yes would be a piece of selflessness, but also to say no as little as possible. To separate oneself, to depart from that to which no would be required again and again. The rationale is that defensive expenditures, be they never so small, become a rule, a habit, lead to an extraordinary and perfectly superfluous impoverishment. Our largest expenditures are our most frequent small ones. Warding off, not letting come close, is an expenditure. One should not deceive oneself over this, a strength squandered on negative objectives. One can merely, through the constant need to ward off, become too weak any longer to defend oneself. Another form of sagacity and self-defense consists in reacting as seldom as possible and withdrawing from situations and relationships in which one would be condemned, as it were, to suspend one's freedom, one's initiative, and become a mere reagent. And lastly, from the I Ching. Every limitation has its value, but a limitation that requires persistent effort entails a cost of too much energy. When, however, the limitation is a natural one, as, for example, the limitation by which water flows only downhill, it necessarily leads to success, for then it means a saving of energy. The energy that otherwise would be consumed in a vain struggle with the object is applied wholly to the benefit of the matter in hand, and success is assured. Chapter 9. Turn the tables. The counterattack strategy. Moving first, initiating the attack, will often put you at a disadvantage. You are exposing your strategy and limiting your options. Instead, discover the power of holding back and letting the other side move first, giving you the flexibility to counterattack from any angle. If your opponents are aggressive, bait them into a rash attack that will leave them in a weak position. Learn to use their impatience, their eagerness to get at you, as a way to throw them off balance and bring them down. In difficult moments, do not despair or retreat. Any situation can be turned around. If you learn how to hold back, waiting for the right moment to launch an unexpected counterattack, weakness can become strength. Disguised aggression. In September 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte faced the greatest crisis until that moment in his career. Austria and Russia had joined in an alliance against him. To the south, Austrian troops were attacking the French soldiers occupying northern Italy. To the east, the Austrian general Karl Marx was leading a large force into Bavaria. A sizable Russian army, under General Mikhail Kutuzov, was on its way to join Marx's army, and this allied force, once merged and expanded, would head for France. East of Vienna, more Russian and Austrian troops were waiting to be deployed wherever needed. Napoleon's armies were outnumbered 2-1. Napoleon's plan was to try to defeat each of the alliance's armies one by one, using his smaller but more mobile corps to fight them before they could join forces. While committing enough troops to produce a stalemate in Italy, he moved into Bavaria before Kutuzov could reach it and forced Marx's ignominious surrender at Ulm, with hardly a shot being fired. See Chapter 6. This bloodless victory was a masterpiece, but to exploit it to its fullest, Napoleon needed to catch Kutuzov before the Russian general could himself be reinforced by more Russian or Austrian troops. To that end, Napoleon sent the bulk of his army east toward Vienna, hoping to trap the retreating Russian forces. But the pursuit bogged down. The weather was bad. The French troops were tired. Their marshals made mistakes. And most important, the wily Kutuzov was cleverer in retreat than in attack. Managing to elude the French, he reached the town of Olmütz, northeast of Vienna, where the remaining Austro-Russian forces were stationed. Now the situation reversed. Suddenly it was Napoleon who was in grave danger. The strength of his corps was their mobility. Relatively small, they were vulnerable individually and worked best when operating close enough to one another to come fast to one another's support. Now they were dispersed in a long line from Munich to Vienna, which Napoleon had taken after his victory over Marx at Ulm. The men were hungry, tired, and short of supplies. The Austrians fighting the French in northern Italy had given up the battle there and were in retreat. But that put them heading northeast, posing a threat to Napoleon's southern flank. To the north, the Prussians, seeing that Napoleon was in trouble, were considering joining the alliance. If that happened, they could wreak havoc on Napoleon's extended lines of communication and supply, and the two armies moving in from north and south could squeeze him to death. Napoleon's options were abysmal. To continue the pursuit of Kutuzov would further extend his lines. Besides, the Russians and Austrians were now 90,000 strong and in an excellent position at Olmütz. To stay put, on the other hand, was to risk being slowly swallowed by armies on all sides. Retreat seemed the only solution, and it was what his generals advised. But with the weather deteriorating, it was mid-November, and the enemy sure to harass him, that would be costly too. And retreat would mean that his victory at Ulm had been wasted, a tremendous blow to the morale of his men. That would virtually invite the Prussians to join the war, and his enemies, the English, seeing him vulnerable, might go so far as to invade France. Whatever path he chose seemed to lead to disaster. For several days he went into deep thought, ignoring his advisors and poring over maps. Meanwhile, at Olmütz, the Austrian and Russian leaders, among them the Austrian Emperor Francis I and the young Tsar Alexander I, watched Napoleon's moves with intense curiosity and excitement. They had him where they wanted him. Surely they would be able to recoup the disaster at Ulm and then some. On November 25th, Alliance scouts reported that Napoleon had moved a large part of his army to Austerlitz, halfway between Vienna and Olmütz. There it looked as if his forces were occupying the Pratzen Heights, a position that would indicate preparation for battle. But Napoleon had only some 50,000 men with him. He was outnumbered nearly 2-1. How could he hope to face the Allies? Even so, on November 27th, Francis I offered him an armistice. Napoleon was formidable, and even at those odds, fighting him was a risk. In truth, Francis was also trying to buy enough time to envelop the French army completely. But none of the alliance generals thought Napoleon would fall for that trick. To their surprise, however, Napoleon seemed eager to come to terms. Suddenly, the Tsar and his generals had a new thought. He was panicking, grasping at straws. That suspicion seemed borne out almost immediately when, on November 29th, Napoleon abandoned the Pratzen Heights almost as soon as he had taken them, assuming a position to their west and repeatedly repositioning his cavalry. He appeared utterly confused. The next day he asked for a meeting with the Tsar himself. Instead, the Tsar sent an emissary, who reported back that Napoleon had been unable to disguise his fear and doubt. He had seemed on edge, emotional, even distraught. The emissary's conditions for armistice had been harsh, and although Napoleon had not agreed to them, he had listened quietly, seeming chastened, even intimidated. This was music to the ears of the young Tsar, who was burning for his first engagement with Napoleon. He was tired of waiting. By abandoning the Pratzen Heights, Napoleon seemed to have put himself in a vulnerable position. His southern lines were weak, and his route of retreat, southwest toward Vienna, was exposed. An Allied army could take the Pratzen Heights, pivot south to break through that weak point in his lines, and cut off his retreat, then move back north to surround his army and destroy him. Why wait? A better chance would never come. Tsar Alexander and his younger generals prevailed over the hesitant Austrian emperor and launched the attack. It began early on the morning of December 2nd. While two smaller divisions faced off against the French from the north, pinning them down, a stream of Russian and Austrian soldiers moved toward the Pratzen Heights, took them, then wheeled to the south, aiming at the French weak point. Although they met resistance from the outnumbered enemy, they quickly broke through and were soon able to take the key positions that would allow them to turn north and surround Napoleon. But at 9 o'clock a.m., as the last alliance troops, some 60,000 men in all, made their way to the heights and headed south, word reached the Allied commanders that something unexpected was afoot. A large French force, invisible to them beyond the Pratzen Heights, was suddenly heading due east, straight for the town of Pratzen itself and the center of the Allied lines. Kutuzov saw the danger. The Allies had advanced so many men into the gap in the French lines that they had left their own center exposed. He tried to turn back the last troops heading south, but it was too late. By 11 o'clock a.m., the French had retaken the heights. Worse, French troops had come up from the southwest to reinforce the southern position and prevent the Allies from surrounding the French. Everything had turned around. Through the town of Pratzen, the French were now pouring through the Allied center and were swiftly moving to cut off the retreat of the Allied troops to their south. Each part of the Allied army, north, center, and south, was now effectively isolated from the others. The Russians in the southernmost position tried to retreat farther to the south, but thousands of them lost their lives in the frozen lakes and marshes in their path. By 5 o'clock p.m., the rout was complete and a truce was called. The Austro-Russian army had suffered terrible casualties, far more than the French. The defeat was so great that the alliance collapsed. The campaign was over. Somehow, Napoleon had snatched victory from defeat. Austerlitz was the greatest triumph of his career. Interpretation. In the crisis leading up to the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon's advisors and marshals had thought only of retreat. Sometimes it is better, they believed, to accept a setback willingly and go on the defensive. On the other side stood the Tsar and his allies, who had Napoleon weak. Whether they waited to envelop him or attacked right away, they were on the offensive. In the middle was Napoleon, who, as a strategist, stood far above both his own advisors and marshals on the one hand, and the Tsar and alliance generals on the other. His superiority lay in the fluidity of his thinking. He did not conceive war in mutually exclusive terms of defense and offense. In his mind, they were inextricably linked. A defensive position was the perfect way to disguise an offensive maneuver, a counterattack. An offensive maneuver was often the best way to defend a weak position. What Napoleon orchestrated at Austerlitz was neither retreat nor attack, but something far more subtle and creative. He fused defense and offense to set up the perfect trap. First, having taken Vienna, Napoleon advanced to Austerlitz, apparently taking the offensive. That startled the Austrians and Russians, even though they still heavily outnumbered him. Next, he backed off and took a defensive position. Then he seemed to switch between offense and defense, giving every appearance of confusion. In his meeting with the Tsar's emissary, he seemed confused personally as well as strategically. It was all high drama, staged by Napoleon to make him look weak and vulnerable, inviting attack. These maneuvers fooled the Allies into giving up prudence, striking out at Napoleon with total abandon and exposing themselves in the process. Their defensive position at Olmütz was so strong and dominant that only leaving it would ruin it. And that was precisely what Napoleon lured them into doing. Then, instead of defending himself against their rash attack, he suddenly switched to the offensive himself, the counterattack. In doing so, he altered the dynamic of the battle not only physically, but psychologically. When an attacking army suddenly has to go on the defensive, its spirit crumbles. And indeed, the Alliance troops panicked, retreating to the frozen lakes that Napoleon had intended as their graveyard all along. Most of us only know how to play either offensively or defensively. Either we go into attack mode, charging our targets in a desperate push to get what we want, or we try frantically to avoid conflict, and if it is forced on us, to ward off our enemies as best we can. Neither approach works when it excludes the other. Making offense our rule, we create enemies and risk acting rashly and losing control of our own behavior. But constant defensiveness backs us into a corner, becomes a bad habit. In either case, we are predictable. Instead, consider a third option, the Napoleonic way. At times you seem vulnerable and defensive, getting your opponents to disregard you as a threat, to lower their guard. When the moment is right and you sense an opening, you switch to the attack. Make your aggression controlled and your weakness a ploy to disguise your intentions. In a dangerous moment, when those around you see only doom and the need to retreat, that is when you smell an opportunity. By playing weak, you can seduce your aggressive enemies to come at you full throttle. Then catch them off guard by switching to the offense when they least expect it. Mixing offense and defense in this fluid fashion, you will stay one step ahead of your inflexible opponents. The best blows are the ones they never see coming. From The Art of War by Sun Tzu. However desperate the situation and circumstances, don't despair. When there is everything to fear, be unafraid. When surrounded by dangers, fear none of them. When without resources, depend on resourcefulness. When surprised, take the enemy itself by surprise. Jiu-Jitsu. In 1920, the Democratic Party nominated Ohio Governor James Cox as its candidate to succeed the retiring President Woodrow Wilson. At the same time, it named 38-year-old Franklin Delano Roosevelt as its vice presidential nominee. Roosevelt had served as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Wilson. More important, he was the cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, still very popular after his presidency in the first decade of the century. The Republican nominee was Warren G. Harding, and the campaign was a grueling affair. The Republicans had a lot of money. They avoided talking about the issues and played up Harding's folksy image. Cox and Roosevelt responded to the Republicans by going on a vigorous offensive, basing their campaign on a single issue of Wilson's, American participation in the League of Nations, which they hoped would bring peace and prosperity. Roosevelt campaigned all over the country, delivering speech after speech. The idea was to counter the Republicans' money with sheer effort. But the race was a disaster. Harding won the presidency in one of the biggest landslides in American electoral history. The following year, Roosevelt was stricken with polio and lost the use of his legs. Coming just after the disastrous 1920 campaign, his illness marked a turning point in his life. Suddenly made aware of his physical fragility and mortality, he retreated into himself and reassessed. The world of politics was vicious and violent. To win an election, people would do anything, stooping to all kinds of personal attacks. The public official moving in this world was under pressure to be as unscrupulous as everyone else and survive as best he could. But that approach did not suit Roosevelt personally and took too much out of him physically. He decided to craft a different political style, one that would separate him from the crowd and give him a constant advantage. In 1932, after a stint as governor of New York, Roosevelt ran as the Democratic presidential nominee against the Republican incumbent, Herbert Hoover. The country was in the midst of the Depression, and Hoover seemed incapable of dealing with it. Given the weakness of his record, a defensive hand was a difficult one for him to play. And like the Democrats in 1920, he went vigorously on the offensive, attacking Roosevelt as a socialist. Roosevelt, in turn, traveled the country, speaking on his ideas for getting America out of the Depression. He didn't give many specifics, nor did he respond to Hoover's attacks directly. But he radiated confidence and ability. Hoover, meanwhile, seemed shrill and aggressive. The Depression would probably have doomed him to defeat whatever he did, but he lost far bigger than expected. The size of Roosevelt's victory, nearly an electoral sweep, surprised one and all. In the weeks following the election, Roosevelt essentially hid from public view. Slowly, his enemies on the right began to use his absence to attack him, circulating speculation that he was unprepared for the challenge of the job. The criticisms became pointed and aggressive. At his inauguration, however, Roosevelt gave a rousing speech, and in his first months in office, now known as the 100 Days, he switched from the appearance of inactivity to a powerful offensive, hurrying through legislation that made the country feel as if something were finally being done. The sniping died. Over the next few years, this pattern repeatedly recurred. Roosevelt would face resistance. The Supreme Court, say, would overturn his programs, and enemies on all sides, Senator Huey Long and labor leader John L. Lewis on the left, Father Charles Coughlin, and wealthy businessmen on the right, would launch hostile campaigns in the press. Roosevelt would retreat, ceding the spotlight. In his absence, the attacks would seem to pick up steam, and his advisors would panic. But Roosevelt was just biding his time. Eventually, he knew, people would tire of these endless attacks and accusations, particularly because, by refusing to reply to them, he made them inevitably one-sided. Then, usually a month or two before election time, he would go on the offensive, defending his record and attacking his opponents suddenly and vigorously enough to catch them all off guard. The timing would also jolt the public, winning him their attention. In the periods when Roosevelt was silent, his opponents' attacks would grow and grow more shrill. But that only gave him material he could use later, taking advantage of their hysteria to make them ridiculous. The most famous example of this came in 1944, when that year's Republican presidential nominee Thomas Dewey launched a series of personal attacks on Roosevelt, questioning the activities of his wife, his sons, and even his dog, the Scotch terrier Fala, whom Dewey accused of being pampered at the taxpayers' expense. Roosevelt countered in a campaign speech, "The Republican leaders have not been content to make personal attacks upon me, or my sons. They now include my little dog, Fala. Unlike the members of my family, Fala resents this. When he learned that the Republican fiction writers had concocted a story that I left him behind on an Illusion Island and had sent a destroyer back to find him, at a cost to the taxpayers of $2 or $3 or $8 or $20 million, his Scotch soul was furious. He has not been the same dog since. I am accustomed to hearing malicious falsehoods about myself, but I think I have the right to object to libelous statements about my dog." Devastatingly funny, the speech was also ruthlessly effective. And how could his opponents reply to it when it quoted their own words right back at them? Year after year, Roosevelt's opponents exhausted themselves attacking him, scoring points at moments when it didn't matter, and losing one landslide election after another to him. Interpretation. Roosevelt could not bear to feel cornered, to have no options. This was partly because of his flexible nature. He preferred to bend to circumstances, changing direction effortlessly as needed. It also came out of his physical limitations. He hated to feel hemmed in and helpless. Early on, when Roosevelt campaigned in the usual aggressive way of American politics, arguing his case and attacking his opponents, he felt hopelessly constricted. Through experiment, he learned the power of holding back. Now he let his opponents make the first move. Whether by attacking him or by detailing their own positions, they would expose themselves, giving him openings to use their own words against them later on. By staying silent under their attacks, he would goad them into going too far. Nothing is more infuriating than engaging with someone and getting no response, and ending up shrill and irrational, which played badly with the public. Once their own aggression had made them vulnerable, Roosevelt would come in for the kill. Roosevelt's style can be likened to jiu-jitsu, the Japanese art of self-defense. In jiu-jitsu, a fighter baits opponents by staying calm and patient, getting them to make the first aggressive move. As they come at the fighter and either strike at him or grab hold of him, either push or pull, the fighter moves with them, using their strength against them. As he deftly steps forward or back at the right moment, the force of their own momentum throws them off balance. Often they actually fall. And even if they don't, they leave themselves vulnerable to a counterblow. Their aggression becomes their weakness, for it commits them to an obvious attack, exposing their strategy and making it hard for them to stop. In politics, jiu-jitsu style yields endless benefits. It gives you the ability to fight without seeming aggressive. It saves energy, for your opponents tire while you stay above the fray. And it widens your options, allowing you to build on what they give you. Aggression is deceptive. It inherently hides weakness. Aggressors cannot control their emotions. They cannot wait for the right moment, cannot try different approaches, cannot stop to think about how to take their enemies by surprise. In that first wave of aggression, they seem strong, but the longer their attack goes on, the clearer their underlying weakness and insecurity become. It is easy to give in to impatience and make the first move, but there is more strength in holding back, patiently letting the other person make the play. That inner strength will almost always prevail over outward aggression. Time is on your side. Make your counterattacks swift and sudden, like the cat who creeps on padded paws to suddenly pounce on its prey. Make jiu-jitsu your style in almost everything you do. It is your way of responding to aggression in everyday life, your way of facing circumstances. Let events come to you, saving valuable time and energy for those brief moments when you blaze with the counterattack. By Vladimir Lenin. The soundest strategy in war is to postpone operations until the moral disintegration of the enemy